Okay, we'll get started here. My name is Hannah Brakke, and I am the Director of Product here at LabKey. And today we're going to be talking about LIMS implementations and really trying to provide some tips and tricks from our experience working with clients and doing LIMS and scientific data software implementation over 20 years and really trying to provide some advice for folks on how to avoid these common pitfalls and fast track productivity in the lab, because of course, that's what everyone's looking for when they're working to implement a LIMS. So maybe some housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to put those in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll either try and keep a lookout for those as we're going or make sure that they're getting answered at the end. And then, of course, we are also recording this webinar and we will be sending it to you after the webinar is complete. So if you're not able to stay the whole time or if you want to share this, just know that that's going to be hitting your inbox as well. So a little bit about me. I actually worked in immunology and infectious disease for about 10 years prior to joining LabKey, and worked with a variety of different types of LIMS systems as well as data management systems. And coming to LabKey, I actually worked as an account manager for several years before I moved into product management. So LabKey in general as a company has been around for over 20 years. We started in the proteomics data management space and have since sort of continued to update our portfolio and our support in the types of scientific data management that we provide. One of the things I think that makes LabKey really unique is that we work very, very closely with our customers. We often sort of partner with them to help with things like implementation and rolling out and ongoing support, and then, of course, continuing to sort of advance the needs of their LIMS software. Every client has a dedicated account manager that gets to know kind of their needs and plans for the future. And one of the other things that we do, especially on the product management side, is ensure that the feedback that we hear, either during LIMS implementations or after as people are using the system, are getting directly incorporated into our roadmap. So a very sort of 360 approach to software and providing LIMS tools for labs across the world. So our services team is really core to this, and this is where we have the dedicated account managers, and we're providing that support for implementation. So in total, we have over 55 years of experience implementing these types of solutions for people. We've supported over 100 implementations, and we really do sort of pride ourselves on providing sort of world-class support. So today, I'm leaning on both my experience as a customer of LIMS, but I also talk to our service team about how we can help provide some tips and tricks from their experience. So we'll see that kind of in both ways today. So in general, why are labs choosing LIMS? How did they get to this point where they're implementing a LIMS system? LIMS stands for Laboratory Information Management System, I'm sure as most of you know here. And really, there are three kind of main reasons why people would choose to go for a LIMS system over other systems or no system. So improving that efficiency, making sure that data quality is upheld, and the traceability of data and samples as well, making sure that you're sort of eliminating manual solutions like spreadsheets or paper and really having that centralized location for all of your laboratory data. And then also making sure that you're laying that foundation for your lab as it scales, either in sample number or project number or user count, for example. And so typically, when we look at what a LIMS adoption lifecycle looks like, we start with the research. And so oftentimes, folks will come to us looking at many different systems to see if LabKey is the right fit, or the vendors that they're looking at. They're doing a very thorough evaluation at this process as well, right? So they do the initial research to kind of get down to maybe 5 or 10 LIMS that they're looking at, going through making sure that the LIMS software is going to work for their needs, and also the vendor is going to work for them, as well as things like pricing and resourcing, and other important logistic factors like that, making that decision, and then the implementation phase. And so that's what we're really focused on today. After implementation, obviously there's going to be adoption. And so we'll touch on that a little bit. But notice here that these arrows are not equal in size. And so typically, implementation is the longest process in this life cycle. And evaluation tends to be the second longest. Sometimes it's the first, depending on your organization and your LIMS vendor. We have a lot of other webinars for evaluation, so I'll sort of plug that if you guys are in that stage and are interested in that. But really, we're going to be focused on this lengthy implementation time, and effectively how can we manage the implementation such that we can shorten it as much as possible to give you the solution as quickly as we can, so that you can start getting value from it, getting those efficiency gains, things like that. So, a good question to kind of ask people, see where you guys are at in your journey, is where you're at in your LIMS adoption. And so, if you want to take just a second here to answer this, we can sort of talk about kind of depending on where people are at. Awesome. So it looks like most of you are kind of somewhere in this phase, rather than sort of having not been started, or really kind of the majority of you are at the end, so towards implementation and adoption. So this is sort of perfect timing to have a webinar like this where we're sort of talking about that. So I'll just end this and move forward. So there are 4 common implementation challenges that we have identified and experienced at LabKey, that we wanted to share. So one of those is sort of that lack of process for planning and scoping. And this can really mean a variety of different things if there's not sort of dedicated staff members, or a clear vision of what your LIMS is meant to accomplish. This can really be very challenging once you go to implement, because it can affect timelines, or cause confusion, or maybe prioritization of the wrong thing. And so making sure that sort of that lack of process is addressed early is very important. Data migration is the second one, where oftentimes people are coming to us or to a different LIMS vendor with tools that they've been using sort of piecemeal, or legacy systems that they're wanting to migrate out of. And so that data migration can also be a big hurdle during implementation as people are sort of moving forward with that. So we'll talk about ways to kind of address that and make sure that we've really got it dialed in. Integration with other instruments, or legacy systems, or other systems, tends to be another sort of hurdle that people are facing. Again, if there's not a clear directive in what that integration should look like, or what exactly it should do, right? Is it a one-way integration? Is it two-way? Are there other systems that we need to keep in mind? That can also drastically slow implementations down. And then the last one, really, that we've kind of created this bucket for, is around user adoption and training. And so you can have the implementation, you can have your LIMS up and running, and then it may take longer to get off the ground if you haven't really considered how you're going to roll this out to users and ensure that training is there as well. So one of the things that I did in preparation for this webinar is talk to our services team and ask them what are the most common bottlenecks that they see during implementation. And so for us, when we're sort of working with our customers, data migration tends to be the most common. And this, I think, can be really boiled down to the fact that there's typically so much data and so much decentralized data to get into the system that it's easy for things to get lost or people to not understand their data fully enough for us to do that migration quickly. Given that many of you are kind of in this journey, I'd be very interested in sort of what your biggest hurdle is, and if that aligns kind of with the things that we're talking about today. If you have put in sort of other for this poll, I'd be very interested to know kind of what else you're seeing as being problematic during this process too. Yeah, so it looks like kind of a mixture of responses again, but sort of primarily folks are struggling with sort of that data migration piece or the integration with existing tools. And so that I think does kind of align. Interesting to see that our service team has not experienced integration maybe as heavily. I do think this is very variable depending on the tools that people are using and the plan. So that totally makes sense. Um, okay, perfect. Let's now go into kind of the best practices for each of these challenges that we're talking about. So for planning and scoping, as I mentioned, it's really important to make sure that you're establishing these key decision makers up front. And so people that are able to answer and decide on an approach. Oftentimes for LIMS in particular, there can be multiple pathways to accomplish the same thing, usually varying levels of difficulty or value to the end user. And so having someone in meetings that's able to understand what the final users of the LIMS is, in order to sort of answer those questions quickly can help with the implementation cycle because we're not then waiting on either having another meeting or having to go back and forth on email, making sure that the people that are most knowledgeable and also have the ability to make a decision are kind of aligned and in the same room is very helpful. Also making sure that there's some type of project management. Oftentimes, LIMS vendors will sort of provide this. We definitely do as well on our side, but to have an internal project manager or champion is also very helpful in order to help with coordination and alignment of teams, especially if it's a big implementation. And then, of course, the doers, the people that are actually going to be executing either configuration or testing of the system, as well as if there's any sort of custom development or code that's happening too. So, making sure that you have those established early and have that buy-in from people can help with the planning and scoping of the project. Making sure that you're really aligned on the goals, I think is another important piece here. Oftentimes we will work with folks that at the beginning of the implementation, we have sort of set goals and we're able to go through and address those very clearly. Sometimes it will happen that there are goals, and then as we get through the implementation, those goals change, which is completely sort of normal. But we've also had, in some rare cases, folks come in with goals that have been established, maybe within a small team that have not been evaluated or sort of vetted by the rest of the team, and then as the implementation is going on it starts to uncover that those actually aren't in alignment. And so making sure that those goals are very clear and they're also aligned with the entire team as well, that everybody can agree, what's the top priority or what is ultimately the goal of the LIMS. The third one here is around sort of documenting those current workflows. And so it can be arduous, I would say, to really go through and document everything that you want to capture within your LIMS, but it can be very helpful to identify early on where the biggest pain points are. And we'll get to sort of prioritization in a little bit as well, but knowing what those workflows are and what the challenges might be in implementation can help establish what priority you should be sort of executing before you go through sort of heavy customization, because it's very possible that that may not be needed if it is not a workflow that is accurate, for example. And then the last one here is really making sure that you're involving those cross-functional stakeholders early, which I sort of mentioned already, making sure that everybody is aligned with what, the LIMS should do and be is going to be super important in that initial stage of the implementation. So these little LabKey tips are things directly from our service team that, again, sort of crowdsourcing, asking what are the best things that we can best advice that we can provide in this webinar. And one of our account managers answered, making sure that you have those clear goals and success metrics, but then also knowing that not everything can be the highest priority. And so making sure that you have a goal established, you know what the success for that goal is, and then also the priority of that goal. So again, ensuring that all of the team is aligned on what is a top priority versus something that might be a nice to have or okay to do sort of later stage during the implementation. So in terms of preparing your data, and this might be sort of the most relevant given that I think most of you are sort of working with the data migration struggle at this time, is really going through and understanding what data you do have right now. That can be also something where you're sort of documenting what type of data is it, what are the formats of data that it is, how different are those formats between potentially different files or different systems. Knowing if you've got sort of a subject matter expert that can also talk about the data, any manipulations that you want to have to that data or things that have happened sort of prior to those files or that system is going to be really, really important in preparing kind of that data for migration, because after you understand what that data is, going through and ensuring that you have kind of a checklist of things for the data. So what should actually be migrated over to the LIMS system? What data might be ignored? So we have lots of scenarios, especially from legacy systems, where there's data that's being either captured or fields that are there that really nobody is using or nobody really understands. There's super old, or just there isn't a subject matter expert to understand what that is. Making sure you're not sort of pulling cruft into a new LIMS. And then in many other cases, there's also data that we want to alter prior to migration. So oftentimes it's like, hey, we have 4 different fields for the date of collection that we want to consolidate and centralize, or we need to perform calculations on some of this data sort of prior to coming in, and we want to apply that too. So going through after you understand that data, basically categorizing it into these 3 categories. What do you want to keep? What do you want to leave? What might need to be altered before moving? And then this last bullet, easier said than done, maybe I'll say, is sort of cleaning and consolidating. So ensuring that the data that you want to migrate is clean. And again, some LIMS vendors will sort of help with this. LabKey often does as well. We have a lot of experience too, where we typically will look at the data that people want to pull in and make suggestions for how we can clean or consolidate the data to really sort of ensure success there. Um, so the lab key tip here, I think, kind of really talks about this whole set of things. But really, knowing that relationship between your data can also be very important in terms of the migration, because the more, again, we understand about that data, the easier it is to build upfront those relationships or even identify things that we might need to build those relationships during the implementation of your LIMS as well. And so for the integration and automation piece, there are really three bullets here that I think can be useful. And this is going to be, pretty variable depending on what you're doing, but in general, making sure that you have identified what are those must-have versus nice-to-have integrations. So in some cases, we'll have customers come to us and it is a must-have to integrate with their external uh, um, ticketing system, for example, versus a nice to have is like at some point we'd like to pull this in and put this into a data lake, or to have this tied into our Tableau or something like that. So really knowing what is the thing that is a must-have for the launch of your LIMS and for people to use the LIMS versus things that you can do sort of post-implementation and continue to work towards and improve upon after that process. Um, there's also lots of other tools that can help reduce custom development, which I'm sure most folks on the call here have recognized that custom development can have a big cycle time. It can also sort of be a cog in this wheel of LIMS implementation. So you can use things and tools like APIs if your LIMS vendor has that, and other middleware to help reduce that custom development. And you can always sort of patchwork or piecemeal those things together and then opt for that custom development later, sort of after the LIMS has been implemented. So again, depending on if this is a must-have versus a nice-to-have, you might be able to stopgap some of these integrations prior to kind of a full automated process. And then the last thing really to focus here is on that long-term maintainability. So oftentimes when we're working with our customers on in integration, we have we offer pros and cons, right? Of you can go this approach, but maybe after we'll say 100,000 files or sort of a nightly process, this may not be the most scalable. And so really trying to think about the system that you're integrating with and what that's going to look like in the future, to make sure that whatever you're doing for that integration is going to be maintainable long term. It's not going to maybe rely on a single person to keep that integration up and running. And then our lab key tip here is, making sure that we have that subject matter expert that can help understand what this looks like, or what these the transfer or integration of data should be, to help make those decisions sort of early and often is going to be important. And so the last one here is around sort of training and change management. And this is the thing that I think gets ignored probably the most during LIMS implementations, mostly because we're so focused on all of that other stuff that training and change management can be kind of an afterthought. And so that's something that our LabKey services team is definitely bringing to the forefront to make sure that we have that built into that implementation, because you want to make sure that you're training your users before you kind of go live into a production environment. There's a lot of stress that happens around change that regardless of how good your LIMS system is, regardless of how well you've, performed these integrations and things like that, if you're not managing kind of that people aspect, it tends to start to drag or you start to get resistance or concerns from people about your new LIMS. And so making sure that there's plenty of time to do training sessions, and also having that support for people as they have questions too, before they're really in the production environment, with a pipette and gloves on the bench and they don't know how to enter something into your system. The other sort of way to help mitigate concerns around change management is really identifying and empowering an internal LIMS champion. And so identifying people at in every group, kind of at every level, that can help champion the LIMS and maybe train people or feel like they can be the point person if somebody has a quick question in the lab about what they're trying to do in the LIMS. And so having those internal champions can really help develop a sense of kind of grassroots support for the LIMS. And then the last one here is making sure that you have that ongoing support after the implementation. There's nothing worse than sort of having this big, showy launch and then sort of a drop off in support. And so when you're evaluating LIMS vendors or when you're talking to your LIMS vendor, ensuring that they have a plan for that support post implementation as well. One of the things that we always like to say here at LabKey is we really want the system to be easy for them to adopt and not an added burden, right? Because obviously moving into a LIMS, it's a change in itself. It's always going to feel a little bit like a burden, but if we can actually make it easy, that's going to lessen that activation energy to get people excited about using the new system. And so now that we've kind of gone through these items, again, sort of asking our service team, what is that like most common mistake that we think happens during implementation? And really it is sort of underestimating this data cleanup needs. So I'm not gonna belabor this too much. It sounds like this is kind of what most folks are struggling with here. But I think it's excuse me, in really good alignment with kind of the reality of the situation is like data, garbage data in is garbage data out, right? So we really want to make sure that that's as clean as possible as we move forward. So um having those sort of tips and tricks for those challenges I think is important. There are some other things that you can do in general that can help make the implementation go smoother and be faster and again provide that value faster to your users. Making sure that you're really engaging your vendor and how they can help you with this process is going to be important. Oftentimes LIMS are a ton of money. You should be able to talk to your vendor about how they're going to help support you in this. One of the things that LabKey provides is this solution design engagement that's actually like a mini implementation, and it's hyper focused and allows for a very quick cycle time where we can effectively, proof of concept out a LIMS within a couple months for somebody to really evaluate, okay, how long might it take after that to sort of implement fully versus is this enough to get us up and running? And frankly, is LabKey the solution for us? So your vendor really should be able to help support this, making sure that you do have a timeline, right? There's lots of times where we engage with customers and one stakeholder will have a timeline in their head and a different stakeholder will have a different timeline. And so making sure that that's established and then also socialized and agreed upon. And then the last thing I think is probably one of the most important things is for prioritization. So understanding what those workflows look like, but then going through and picking a primary use case to focus on first. And oftentimes we talk to our customers about how you choose that primary use case. And so sometimes people will choose the hardest one, right? Like we want to go through and do the hardest thing first and run into all of the challenges that we might do ahead of time so that every single use case after that becomes easier and easier. The other way that people can think about it is the greatest need, right? We don't have a process for managing this shipping workflow. We really need to get that in first because right now we're missing shipments or having kind of misalignment on that process. Um, and then the last sort of angle to look at this is what is the most likely to succeed, right? So sometimes people will go for the quick wins of we want to get people using our limbs very quickly, and so we want to choose kind of the lowest hanging fruit to get people into the system, and we'll go ahead and build on that once we get it in. The next thing that I'm going to do is actually talk about a specific customer that we implemented and kind of how we tackled these for them. I'd be very curious, kind of knowing what you know now, sort of what is your lab persona, and where you guys are at today. Awesome. Yeah, so it looks like, again, kind of a mix of things. Primarily, though, most folks are spreadsheet survivors, which frankly, like that's where I've been in most of the organizations that I've worked at prior to kind of getting into a system. I had a feeling that this would be the case, and we're actually I was sort of wanting to have our results to look at this because our real world example really is sort of this example of a spreadsheet survivor. They are a biobank that needed to migrate away both from their legacy system, but then also sort of a myriad of spreadsheets that they were using to manage all of their data. And so one of the things that we've identified here is kind of those primary needs. So what they needed to do was have detailed information about their participants and the sample metadata that was coming in. They also wanted to include images and documents directly on that participant and sample metadata. That was a really primary use case for them, as well as the ability to easily migrate that legacy data and, of course, make improvements on the process. The second main need that they had was to integrate with external systems like their billing system. They had a participant database and a specimen marketplace that they needed to be able to integrate with. And then lastly, being able to track those sample shipments, including sort of tracking numbers and who the client was that they were sending that out to. So the first thing that we did here, of course, is focused on planning and scoping. So what we wanted to do was identify that internal LIMS champion early. And so in this case, it was actually very easy for us. It was a person that had been part of the evaluation process already. And so we had a good rapport with them, and they had the right level of input in both the decision making as well as sort of the laboratory experience that helped kind of bridge that gap. We also made sure that we had a hands-on trial with their real workflows prior to the implementation. So they had a really good sense of our software prior to even purchasing it. And that made the implementation then much faster once that decision was made. And then the last thing that we did, again, kind of early on in the implementation process and even some in the sales process, is that we engaged those external software vendors and we created these proof of concept integrations. So we knew that the integrations were going to be successful in the implementation. It was more about building it out and having it be scalable and maintainable as we talked about. And so the other big piece here was preparing the data. And so one of the things that we identified early was what were the critical data that needed to be migrated over. And so making sure that we knew what needed to be migrated when, and in this case, it was the legacy system was actually getting end of life. And so they needed to get out by a certain date. And so we prioritized that data over the spreadsheet data because the timeline was tight on that. We also made sure that we had a very good understanding of what that legacy system data looked like. So oftentimes we iterate with our customers and our clients to say, okay, let's do sort of a full audit of all of these fields. Again, sort of bucketing them into what are we migrating, what are we ignoring, what are we modifying, and then of course mapping that data to the new LIMS system. The other thing that we were able to do with that iteration process is identify actual problems that had been in the legacy data prior to migrating. And so in some cases, there was sort of a missed opportunities maybe to have kind of some of those data integrity pieces that our LIMS provides that the legacy system didn't. And so making sure that those got resolved ahead of time made sure that the data coming in was really clean and we were able to really shore that up. And then lastly, making sure that we sort of iterated through that migration plan. So we would do sort of a test migration and then identify, oh, there's other fields that we need to ignore or modify or map to a different place, and then do that again. So kind of multiple iterations of that helped get that data in a very clean state. And then for the integration and automation of the system, making sure that we did work with those external partners. We had multiple meetings with our account manager and the external partners as well as the customer. So everybody was aligned on what that process would look like and identifying kind of that best integration method. So in this case, we really went with APIs for the most of it because a lot of these systems had their own APIs, and this would be a very scalable way to perform the integrations. We also provided training documentation and sample scripts to the external partners. So rather than kind of throwing that over the fence for them, we really worked closely with them to help ensure their success in working with the data coming out of our system. And then it's a simple one, but communication, right? Making sure that everybody is involved and we're updating status and understanding what problems are arising quickly to be able to address those as fast as possible. And so the last one for the training and change management, we worked with that primary LIMS champion to help develop a tailored training. So instead of providing either sort of the a out of the box sort of training or forcing the client to do their own training, we worked very closely with them to develop a tailored training plan of what are the best things that we want to make sure that the users get trained on first, and then how deep we wanted to go for each of those. Making sure that we also had additional documentation and training videos, so not everybody learns the same way, and so having kind of many options of how people might ingest that information. And we also held multiple training sessions, so we wanted the opportunity for anybody busy in the lab to be able to join at their convenience and really get that hands-on training as well. And then the other thing I think that makes LabKey different in particular, but very good to help with change management, is making sure that you're sort of empowering people to speak up if there's a process that isn't going to work, or that it is going to be too challenging, or they're going to have to make workarounds or concessions for. And so making sure that you're providing that environment that's helping empower people, I think is very useful. And so the last thing here is we're kind of closing. I asked our team as well, what has been sort of the best implementation best practice that you've seen success on? And for us at LabKey, it's really designating that internal champion. And so the better the partnership between your lab and the LIMS vendor, I think the more success the implementation is going to have, because people frankly on both sides get really invested. And so that's something just to kind of take away for the folks that are working on the implementation right now. And then lastly, some sort of key takeaways here. So making sure that you start small, you're really planning smart, right? Making sure that that planning is done prior to getting the work done, and engaging your team. Using the vendor's expertise to help support this. Again, we as vendors have done this for a lot of years for a lot of different types of clients. At this point, I feel like we've almost seen it all. I'm sure other LIMS vendors feel the same. And so ensuring that you're really getting the support you need from your vendor. And then the last thing is at the end of this, we'll be sending out an email. Will include this LIMS readiness checklist that can also help sort of guide you as you're working through the implementation as well. I'm a checklist type of person, so I love a list where I can like check something off. Our biggest LabKey tip here is to make sure that you're tracking those goals, and Q can actually mark off accomplishments as they get achieved. And that, I think, just has a good morale boost as you're going through this sometimes very arduous process. So just kind of a quick overview of what LabKey's LIMS provides. We really have a sample-centric LIMS system that can help optimize those laboratory workflows and maximize productivity. We've really focused on making sure that it's intuitively designed, so that it's easy for people to adopt and adjust over time. So that tends to really shorten those implementation times as well. And then making sure also that you have the data in your LIMS system that can help provide decision making in the future. So, excuse me, by providing reporting and visualizations or integrations with these external tools, it can really help support the efficiency and productivity of your organization. And so with that, I think we'll kind of close out. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat. And just know that again, we'll be recording this. We'll send it out afterwards, as well as a link to that LIMS checklist you can download. And if you're interested in learning about our LIMS, I'm happy to set up a demo as well. Excuse me. Okay, yeah, looks like we have sort of a few questions here. Um, in terms of somebody's asking about sort of the average implementation time for a LIMS, I think it can really vary depending on the organization and the vendor that you're working with. But for our experience, we're looking at about 12 weeks. So really, it's more sort of in the weeks to months phase instead of the months to years, which I've definitely experienced with other LIMS, and we've heard from other customers as well. The second question here is, what do I recommend for a testing environment? And I think maybe this is around kind of one of the points where I was saying that it would be good for having to have users sort of test the system prior to the official sort of go live. And in that case, what I would actually recommend is having a sandbox environment. And some LIMS vendors, including us, will offer a sandbox environment as part of the product package. And so that's something to look out for as well. To be able to have a sandbox environment, not only for that initial user training, but as you want to add new workflows as well, it can really help. Provide a quick sort of setup where you're not having to spend a lot of time kind of getting a setup on your own as well. And then the last question here is how much does an implementation cost? Which I think is also, very variable depending on the vendor and the organization. For some vendors working, in personal experiences, especially kind of some of the legacy systems that I have experience with in the lab, they can really vary quite a bit, but somewhere between 50,000 to 500,000 depending on again the vendor and the organization and what the level of customization is. Typically for us for implementation, all of the support around implementation is included as part of the subscription price, and so that's something if you're in that research or evaluation phase to understand what is your vendor wanting to charge or charging you for that additional support. And so for us at LabKey, that's all built into the pricing so we can avoid concern sort of later on about how to implement. Okay. Looks like kind of I've answered all the questions here. If you have any other questions, feel free to send us an email, and definitely reach out if you're interested in chatting with us more about implementations, or getting a demo of our LIMS system. So with that, thank you. I hope you all have a good afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are today. See ya.